Shakespeare, I want to say a few words about what literature is, and then what poetry is, and then what lyric poetry is, before we dive in, just to give us some background. Don't take all of this as gospel. I'd say take it more as a proposal that we're operating on, that we are free to adjust as we see fit. So first, I want to talk about what literature is, and maybe paradoxically, let's start by what literature isn't. Sometimes we hear claims that amount to this, that literature is merely clever or beautiful writing. This gets at something that's true about literature, but the problem with that opinion is that many non-literary works are clever and beautiful. I think of Newman's essays as a particular example, or Hume's, anything that Hume wrote. Whatever you think of the content, the writing is superb. Or Lincoln's speeches. There's many, many examples of clever or beautiful writing that's not literature. So we have to move past that opinion about it. The more common opinion I find is that literature is like a coded message with a hidden meaning that you have to figure out, like a puzzle or a riddle or an Easter egg hunt, to keep multiplying metaphors. I think this is wrong too. Sometimes I scandalize the freshmen here by telling them that there is no message in the Iliad. And they look at me with eyes wide open, suggesting, why on earth do we read it then? So, someone's trying to call me. This is not a good time. Here's the proposal I want to make. That literature is the verbal and imaginative expression of our experience of the world, or of God, that lays bare the richness of that experience and renders it so as to move us emotionally. A lot in there. I think all of those things need to be said to give a full account of it.
Are you going to repeat that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
The proposal is that literature is the verbal, imaginative expression of our experience of the world or of God, laying bare the richness of that experience and rendering it in a way that moves us emotionally. And a part of this I'm borrowing from the late, great Louise Cowan, who taught at the University of Dallas, who claims that our most profound experiences have a great deal in common because we're all human. So much so that in those experiences of life, we traverse the same terrains as other people do, although, of course, our individual paths will be unique. And she thinks that great literature condenses those experiences and sheds light on those experiences. And I think that's right. In general, traditionally speaking, literature does this in two basic forms. The first is drama, performed literature, which Aristotle would refer to as tragedy and comedy, generally speaking. In the modern world, we have things like tragicomedies, kind of funny combinations, but those are the two standard dramatic forms. The second form that literature takes is narration, and I mean that broadly. Epic poetry is the most ancient form of that in the West, probably, but the novel, in more modern times, the short story, are all narrative literature. And lyric poetry that we're going to be spending time on is at least sometimes narrative. It could be argued that it's always narrative. I don't think it is, but it's at least sometimes narrative. It's not performed, it's recited or sung or spoken. So those are the forms that it takes. Perhaps more importantly is that in the West, for the most part, literature has been written in verse or performed or recited in verse, meaning it's poetic. The epics and tragedies and comedies and the lyric poetry that we have as part of our tradition have been, for the great part, verse, in verse form rather than in prose. But from the Renaissance onward, prose became more and more common. And that gave us the novel and the short story. There are questions about when the novel begins as a form. What is the first novel in the West? Some people think it's Don Quixote, and certainly that has a claim for it. That's a hard one to categorize. But it's the Renaissance or later that the novel comes into existence. And in our modern times, prose is a pretty dominant form of literature. That's not true in the ancient world. I'll say more about that in a little bit. So that's a background about literature. Now, poetry. What is poetry? I want to start with an initial approach here. Sometimes we use the word poetry interchangeably with literature, and we just mean literature. Whether it's in prose or it's in verse, it doesn't matter. We call it poetry sometimes. But our usual way of speaking is not that. Usually, or at least often, we have a more specific meaning in mind. So we will refer to literature that is written or spoken in verse and say that's poetry. And that's the one I want, the meaning I'm leaning on here for the class. So then the question is, what is verse? What does it mean to be in verse or versified? It means to have meter, to have a regular rhythm. You might call it a pattern of movement. There's a reason why we call the basic elements of a poem's verses feet. They move, right? They move around, the feet walk and perform dances. So there's a kind of regularity of movement that constitutes poetry as verse. And here it's helpful and I think important to note what another professor, Karl Maurer, points out in an essay he wrote that's really brilliant on Greek and Roman lyric poetry. He says the ancient world, the ancient Greeks in particular, and Romans, but especially the Greeks, considered this regular rhythm to be essential to poetry. And they saw or thought of it as mimicking or participating in the regular patterns of the world, the regular turnings of the world. In fact, the word verse itself in the Latin means turning, a turning around. So they saw poetic verse as copying the turnings or patterns that the world itself has embedded in it. So the sun moves and turns, or looks like it turns. The seasons turn, they change regularly. Humans walk with regularity. We don't walk irregularly. We breathe, we have a heartbeat. All of these are regular movements of the world around us that poetry copies and mimics. And for them, that was essential to poetry. Without it, you didn't have poetry. In fact, Aristotle notes in his Poetics the kinds of poetry and then says, well, I guess there could be some that's in prose, but there's not much out there in the ancient world that's prose that would even qualify. Closely related to this is the fact that poems are traditionally thought of and sometimes called songs. So the Latin has several words for poems. One is poema, but the other is carmen, carmina in the plural, songs. And this is because the poet, and in particular the Greek poet, sings the poem. If you know your Homer or your Virgil, or Hesiod, or Pindar, the poet calls on the muse so that he can sing the muse's words. Sing goddess, sing muse the words I need to sing. It's sing, it's not say, it's not read silently in my own head, it's sing. Poems are songs. Poets sing poems. because the rhythm of the poem makes it musical. It makes it song. Now, that varies depending on the language. Greek is particularly musical in this regard, and English is more like normal speech. But there's always a musical element to Western poetry. And on top of that, the elevated language that poetry tends to employ calls for singing. It calls forth that reaction in us. So for at least those two reasons, poems are songs or approach songs. And a little sign of this is the fact that we refer to the words in songs as lyrics. Lyrics, like lyric poetry. So there's that commonality there. Okay, meter, rhythm. We need to say a few things about what it means for a poem to have rhythm or meter. In Greek and Latin, it's a fair bit different. Meter was achieved by writing in lines that had a set number of syllables that were arranged in a regular pattern of long syllables and short syllables. And by long and short there, I mean how long it took to say the syllable. So even in our own language, we notice that certain syllables take a long time to say relative to other syllables because of how many letters are in there, that is how many sounds that are constituted by the syllable, or the particular sound that we make. Some sounds take longer to say than others. So in Latin and Greek, they divided up their syllables into longer and short, and then they put those together in a regular pattern to give a rhythm to their poetry. And in Homer and Virgil, the great Greek and Latin epic poets, that meter is dactylic hexameter, which is a fancy Greek way of saying it's got 6 feet, 6 parts to every line, 6 sets of syllables, and each of those parts is a dactyl. A dactyl is a poetic foot that consists of a long and 2 shorts. Dactyl comes from the word for finger. Your finger has a longer portion and then 2 shorter ones. So a dactylic line is long, short, short. Bum 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 bum. And that rumbling continues for 24 books if you're Homer. Putting your poetry in that form is demanding. It's really demanding on the poet. He has to be a master of his language and he has to have a perfect ear to do it well. But the payoff is immense. One of the payoffs for us and for him is that it's pleasing. It's beautiful to hear that regularity. It pleases the audience. And in poetry, you got to get your audience on board. If you don't, it's over. But on top of that, for the ancients, it's also a memory aid. If you have that rhythm, it's easier to remember your lines. And of course, most of these poets are singing these from memory. So that regularity of syllable and of line is a helpful aid for remembering the line itself. They didn't have books and digital copies of Word documents back then, obviously. In English, it's different. It's a newer language. Even Old English is much newer. So whether we're talking about Old English or Middle English or Modern English, meter is achieved by writing in lines with a set number of syllables, like in Latin and like in Greek. But here in English, we arrange our syllables not according to the long and short, the length of time it takes to say each syllable. We arrange them according to whether we've stressed the syllable or haven't stressed the syllable. So when I say syllable, the syll there is what I'm stressing. I say syllable, not syllable or syllable. I say syllable. So the syll sound gets the stress. So the word syllable itself is a dactyl, as you know. Syllable, boom, 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 syllable, syllable. So we can keep the forms like dactylic hexameter and the other kinds that Greek and Roman literature have, but we decide on what constitutes a dactyl for us, or a particular poetic foot, is based not on the long and short. It's based on syllable stresses. In Old English, and this is probably most commonly seen in Beowulf, a magnificent poem, the meter is based merely on the stresses, often called the accent. It's divided, each line in Old English verse is divided into two parts. You're going to have an equal number of stresses on either side. There's no requirement that you have a certain number of syllables for every line. It can vary, but you need to have a certain number of accents or stresses on every line. As English developed, that became more complicated. So in Middle English and in modern, Middle English, for Middle English, it's probably best to take Chaucer as the example. He's probably the most famous writer in Middle English. And modern, which is, if you want to say which of the greats initiates modern English, it's going to be Shakespeare. For Middle and modern English, we do in our poetry tend to have a set number of syllables per line. And it's arranged according to the regular pattern of stresses or accents. So you could still have your dactylic hexameter. You just have stress, no stress, no stress, stress, no stress, no stress, or accent, to put it that way. Now, the dominant form, this is a word you'll hear or see if you're reading about English poetry. The dominant form this takes is called blank verse, which I've always found to be a funny way of putting it, blank verse. Blank verse is English verse that is based on stresses or accents, which is iambic, and it's pentameter. I'm throwing a lot of things at you here, so let me explain iambic, pentameter. Iambic refers to the kind of poetic unit that you're using, what's called the foot, the basic unit. So the dactyl is the finger, long, short, short. The iamb is boom, 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 like a heartbeat. Short, long, or better yet, because it's English, there's no short and long. No stress, stress. In fact, boom. That's a 2-syllable foot, the iamb, I-A-M-B. Pentameter means you got 5 of them every line. So you have 5 iambs for every line. That will give you 10 syllables for each line, because every iamb has 2 syllables. You can cheat and have 11, but usually it's 10. When you do that, when you have your 10 or 11 syllable line made of iambs, then that's iambic pentameter, and that's called blank verse if you don't rhyme. You can also rhyme, and I think we moderns tend to think of poetry as requiring or usually having rhyme, but most English poetry traditionally doesn't actually have rhyme. It's unrhymed. And you wouldn't rhyme in Greek. It would be barbaric, because they have an inflected language, and so their endings are often the same on purpose. In English, we don't have endings that are the same very often. So for us, it's a cool feature of poetry, and for them, it's just child's play. So English, we often have rhyme, but we don't have to have rhyme. So for a long period of time, from Chaucer onward, through Shakespeare, Milton, the 18th century that we tend to skip over, Pope and Dryden, then the Romantics, Keats, Wordsworth, Tennyson, all those folks, onward into the late 19th century. That kind of meter is not the only meter, but it's the dominant one. Certain poets tried other kinds. They tried the dactylic. It doesn't work well with English, the English language, it seems. The iambic seems to work best. That's a big claim, and maybe we can see if that works based on our experience with the poems for the next 8 weeks. But that was the dominant one. Around the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, maybe a little earlier, English poetry started to break off from that requirement or convention and adopted what is often called free verse. Now, some of the critics and poets of the time thought that was a contradiction in terms, and maybe it is, but it basically means verse that's free. It's free of those restrictions. It doesn't have the set conventional rules that you need to have 10 syllables per line. Each foot has to be roughly the same kind of foot. It has to be an iamb. They would write more off the cuff, you might say. And they'd try to have a rhythm, but not a rhythm that was set and conventional. Whether or not that was successful is still an open question. We will probably get to a few poems that attempt this, a few. Okay, so that's kind of crash course in versification, if you will. Any questions so far? It's a lot to throw at you. Fire away.
Got one. How important does oral or audible reading become when the emphasis is on major and round or major in?
When the emphasis is on, say it again.
When the emphasis is on syllables and structure, what's the difference, or what is the, I don't know, the comparison between reading audibly and reading silently?
It's an important difference. So important that I believe it was Julius Caesar who was first noted as reading silently to himself in public, and people thought that was the strangest thing in the world. He would read out loud. So traditionally, reading out loud is really important. I still think it is important. In fact, we're going to read out loud every poem that we talk about. I think it's that important because the very sound of the poem on your ears is a part of the effect that the poem has. Now, you can recreate that to some extent by reading silently, but you can't recreate the experience fully. So it really needs to be said by someone who has a decent grasp of the language enough to be able to read it according to its diction and its punctuation. So I think it's really important, precisely because it does lean on and make use of the power of not just the meanings of the words, but the very words that you've chosen in the way that they sound. I do think it's really important. Does that answer the question? Any others?
Earlier you were talking about how for the Greeks that the rhythm of poetry itself was necessary for, of course, memorizing or knowing your lines, but also because it was a direct reflection of the rhythm of life itself. And that just called to mind sort of a simple, I guess, maybe overly simplified definition that I've heard of poetry since I was pretty young, which is that it's an imitation of a human act or a human action. Yeah. And I just wondered if that was similar to that definition, or if that definition is lacking something. Yeah. In that sense. And if that's even true. If that's even true.
Yeah. Yeah, that's you heard that when you were young. You had someone around you who knew his Aristotle or knew her Aristotle. That's Aristotle's initial account of poetry, but it's an account that very vague in general, and he knows it is because it applies to dance and applies to painting and other arts. So I think it's true about poetry to say that it imitates human actions. If you mean that broadly enough, modern poetry really is going to stretch that. And even poetry in Shakespeare's time is going to stretch that. But I don't know that the versification and the need for it flows out of that very aspect of poetry itself that it's imitating, because you can imitate human actions just in prose stories, right? Like think of the Pecos Bill stories when I was a kid. I love those stories. Those are all in prose. You can pull off stories in prose, yeah, for sure. Flaubert does. One of my favorite short story writers is Flaubert. It's fantastic. Prose. Yeah.
So it's related though, Barbara, I think, to the music of the spheres.
Yeah.
That idea from the Middle Ages through the Renaissance that plays in Shakespeare quite a bit.
Okay.
Yeah, they thought there was a regularity of motion in the heavens that was clear as in the ancient world itself, and that music itself was built into that. The ratios that notes have to each other in the scale was the ratio of bodies moving to towards each other. And in some ways, poetry is an attempt to imitate that intelligibility in the world. Yeah. So it's much more meaningful for them in that respect than it is for us.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Good. Okay. So that's verse. That's the verse side, the meter or the rhythm side of poetry. Very, very simple account. It's not complete, and we'll say more about that as we go. I'll have to give you a few more things before we start delving into it, but that's the background I think is sufficient for now. I do want to say a few more things about what poetry has or is that we need to attend to as we go forward, because there's not just versification in literature that makes it poetry. There are other elements or qualities that poetry has. In fact, I think it's arguable, I think it's true to argue that at its fullness or its zenith, poetry makes use of all the various powers that human speech contains. That's a big claim. What do I mean by those powers? Let me give a list, or at least a beginnings of a list. Poetry can make use of the logical order that we have in our speech. It's almost always present in some fashion in our speech. By that, I just mean the structure or the unity that our sentences have, and that our sentences have towards each other, and that our paragraphs have towards each other, and therefore a story would have in itself. The plot of the story, the themes that show up would have a unity, a relationship to each other that is logical. And that's something that poetry assumes about speech and makes use of when it operates. Something else that it makes, that's pretty obvious. Something less obvious that it makes use of, but very powerful and critical, in fact, is that poetry and poets, I should say, poets not only attempt to find words to express what they mean, that's called denotation. They're interested in the denotation of the word, the meaning of the word. What does the word mean? They want to use the word that means precisely what they mean. But very importantly for poetry in particular, they also attend to the connotation of the word, meaning what are the accrued tones or flavors or extra meanings that word has, or the ambiguities that word has. So several words can have the same meaning, but very different connotations. Let me give you an example. If I go up to my dad and I say, "Hey, Dad," that's one word that means a particular thing, dad. Or I can say, "Daddy," and that means the same thing, but it has a different connotation. It's more intimate, probably more childlike, certainly more intimate. Or I can say, "Father," comma. That's very formal. That might belong for us to 19th century literature or something like that. We rarely would speak that way, probably. But all three of those words mean the same thing. Where they differ is the connotation, the formality or the lack of formality, the intimacy or lack of intimacy, the respect or lack of explicit respect. The connotation also includes things like, where has this word been used before in our culture? So when I use a word like daddy, I can think about songs that have used that word. And in fact, I might be using that word because I've heard it in songs. And now if I put it in a poem or put it in speech in general, those songs come to my mind. And the fact that they come to my mind alters or changes or adjusts how I experience that word. Poetry makes use of that explicitly. It's the one great human art that tries to rope in that power of connotation to serve the purposes of the poet. It's fantastic. Another word like that means the same thing, papa. That's 4 right there that means exactly the same thing, but their connotations are different. Actually, there's a 5th that I'm aware of, my old man. Right? We don't use that word very often. But using any of those 5 words, you have the same denotation, the same meaning, but your connotations are quite different. And we as speakers of English would be sensitive to those changes in the connotation. If you went up to, let's say you were giving a formal speech in response right after your dad gave a speech and said, at the beginning of your speech, thanks, Daddy, for the speech. That would strike us as odd. You need to be more formal. So we have certain expectations that are built into the connotations of words, and those all play a role in poetry. So it's not enough for us to look at a poem and say, what does this word mean? What does this word mean? What does this word mean? We have to look at what are the connotations of this word? What flavor does it have? Does it change the tone or the formal character of the poem at all? That's an important one. Also important, so we have logical order or structure. We have connotation. Literary and rhetorical devices. Really vague terms right there. It can include a whole bunch of things. Literary devices are things like alliteration. When you begin, when you say a line or 2 or 3 and you start every or many of the words with the same syllable, you're alliterating. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. It's kind of fun. I am unduly attached to alliteration, so you're going to hear me do that, and you're going to just have to deal with that. I'm a big fan. Great poets will often make use of the alliteration. It gets our attention, it grabs us, and we enjoy it. Imagery, to use an image or a metaphor is itself a literary device that poets do often and intentionally. Homer is the great master of the simile, which is comparing what he's describing to something else that might help shed light on the thing that he's describing. So they'll say, just like blah, 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 and he'll go on for line after line after line after line. Then he'll say, so also in this case, blah, 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 blah. And those similes, they're called, are among the greatest in literature. Homer's, they're called Homeric similes. They're fantastic. They're often long, and they're always beautiful. And they're almost always pastoral. They're drawn from farming or from shepherds or some agricultural and peaceful environment. Chiasmus, a very common device used in the ancient world, is when you say something, then you say something else, then you repeat the something else, and then you say the something. So you sandwich it. A, B, B, A. Or A, B, C, C, B, A. You've got a sandwich. The bread on the outside, inside you have mirroring content. So for example, scripture does this a lot. Someone pointed out to me, Exodus chapter, I want to say 14, has an enormously long chiasmus that consists of 8 things that are then gone. He goes 8, A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and then backwards, H, G, F, etc., back to A. The ancient world loved using chiasmus. That's a powerful device that writers will use, that poets will use in particular. Rhyming. Rhyming is a literary device. Irony. Irony is a very common literary or rhetorical device in which the speaker will present something and then hold it at arm's length in a way that questions whether he's accepting it or not, or will cast a certain light on it that might be negative or questioning. We'll see some of that in the poems that we read. There's dozens and dozens of different devices that the ancients had a whole catalog of these things. The rhetoricians need to know all of them to make use of them. But poets will also use rhetorical devices. They'll use literary devices. And the last one I want to mention is tone. This one's hard to define, but how something feels is of critical importance in poetry. So if you've read your Chaucer, or at least the major stories in the Canterbury Tales, if you've read the Knight's Tale and the Miller's Tale, you can compare those two and say, what's different? The tone is different. One is written by a drunk miller who's upset with the knight's characterization of things and thinks that it's completely unrealistic and ridiculous. But the knight is very formal, very wordy. It's an 80 or 90 page story. Very wordy, flowery descriptions of things. It's beautiful, it's ethereal, it's also abstract and a little bit unrealistic. The miller is right. That's the tone of it. The miller's tone is crass, vulgar, concrete, to the point, and hilarious. So tone, many of those words there capture the difference in tone. We'll see more about that as we go through the poems, what it means to say tone. Okay. So the point here is that poetry can make use of any of the powers that human speech has within it, not just what it means to say this word, but all the powers I can bring to bear on my speech that will be noticeable or at least have an effect on my audience in different ways. Poetry makes use of that. So given that, how should we propose what poetry is? And here's what I want to propose about poetry. That poetry is language organizing experience, imaginatively, as all literature does. And here I'm going to borrow a word from the late, great Tom Howard. If you knew Tom Howard, bully for you because he's fantastic. He also says ceremonially. Poetry is language organizing experience ceremonially. You might say liturgically if you really want to push it. Thereby elevating our common or uncommon experience of the world. Someone experiences something in their life or in the world outside them or in their friends or in their relationship with God. They use language to express that experience. They do so imaginatively, not in philosophical language, but in imaginative language, and ceremonially, meaning they're elevating it, they're putting it in front of us for us to see, to look at as such. They elevate that experience by putting a form on it, or imposing, you might say, a form on it through language and all the powers that I've kind of gone through, at least in a rough form, all the powers that language has. Using all that equipment, if you will, all those tools in poetry's toolkit, the poet will craft that experience in speech, thereby giving the experience a form, meaning an intelligibility for us to grasp it, to feel it, to see it. And what does that accomplish? I think three things, vaguely or roughly put. It makes us attend to the thing that's experienced more carefully. There are things in the world that we have happily and unconsciously blow right past. You've heard the phrase, stop and smell the roses. Poets love that phrase. Their job is to make us stop and smell the roses. Their poems make us attend to things that we've blown right by. There's lots of modern poems about ravens, crows, insects, little things. It just says stop and take a look at this. So they help us attend to the thing more carefully. And in doing so, they help us see it more deeply. It's not just to pay attention to this, but see what this is. This is something worth seeing. It's something deeper than you thought. And by doing that, the third thing I think poetry does is it helps us, it makes us, or propels us, I'm not sure what makes, propels, as opposed to compels, us to respond emotionally to that presentation. And that's critical for all literature, is that it's aimed ultimately at bringing about some kind of emotional state in us. Not just an emotional state, but there's got to be an emotional response. If there's no emotional response, I would say, bottom line, there's no literature. And that's kind of where I'm going to hang my hat as far as literature goes. There's got to be an emotional response that's attempted to be, that's sought or attempted to be achieved by the poem. If it doesn't achieve it, then either something's wrong with us, the reader, or with the poet, or maybe both possible. So Tom Howard, I referred to before, he was a Christian apologist. He died a few years ago. He became a Catholic later in life, I guess midway in his life. I would, in my limited experience, I would say he might be the greatest prose writer that I'm aware of in the last 50 years. He has a beautiful little section on poetry in a beautiful little book called Chance or the Dance. Beautiful book. And here's what he says. He says, what would otherwise escape us is halted and addressed by poetic language. Or more accurately, we are halted. It's as though poetry laid a hand on our arm and said, now steady, you are missing this in your prosaic, dashing past experience. And this is worth not missing. This is part of the business of poetry, from the nursery rhyme to the Divine Comedy. It addresses our imagination. And with everything that is at its service, it tries to beguile us into the intense awareness of experience, speaking the language that is suggested to us by our imagination as the real language of things. That's all Tom Howard. And he spends a few pages analyzing 1 foot up and 1 foot down. That's the way to London town. I should say analyzing, appreciating, showing you, what does this mean? Oh, the meaning's obvious. Well, is it so obvious? How is it powerful? It's a beautiful little 3 pages, 4 or 5 pages. Attentive readers, I think, and the poets themselves bear witness to this formal or ceremonial, I'm calling it, character of poetry. That the poet is laying before us an experience of the world that's expressed with that full imaginative power that words have or are capable of, and giving to that experience that he's presenting a form, a linguistic form, a language form, a poetic form that reveals it for what it is. Now, this is certainly true of the ancient Greeks. Again, as Dr. Maurer notes, he says that poetry for the ancient Greeks came from the gods. The muses are the daughters of Zeus. And it didn't just come from the gods. Poetry was the gods' way of revealing the order of the world to humans. Here's how things are, folks. That's what Greek poetry is supposed to be. Here's how things are. And this is the reason why, by the way, Greek poetry had an authoritative public role that is completely foreign to us. The most public poetry for us is probably what the poem at the presidential inauguration, that we kind of think, oh yeah, here's that person coming to say a few fancy words. Let's get on to the real stuff. We don't have a public appreciation of poetry, or very little. For the Greeks, this would be unable for them, they wouldn't be able to think about that. That would be impossible. Poetry is tied up in religion and music. Okay, so much about poetry. Questions? Thoughts, comments? Okay. Lyric poetry. After all, the class is about lyric poetry, not just poetry. So what is lyric poetry? And here I have to confess, things get wobbly. It's not obvious. It's not a word that has a very crystal clear meaning, but I'll propose what I have in mind. One of the principal meanings of the word, which I'm going to employ for the course, is this: poetic literature that's not necessarily dramatic or epic, that is tragedy or comedy or epic, but rather smaller in scope and usually, therefore, usually shorter. That's all negative. What's the positive point here? The positive proposal is that lyric poetry is love poetry in the broad sense of that word love. I mean, poetry that's about the joy in things that we love or the loss of that joy. Now, I have to make a lot of caveats here. This is not cut and dried. Drama and epic poetry often have moments or portions that are what we call lyric poetry. So it's not as if there's one canister that has lyric poetry and then the different canisters that have drama. They interweave with each other. Okay, so that's the proposal about what lyric poetry is. It seems to me that lyric poetry or love poetry, put broadly, has three fundamental emotional attitudes. Some people call them moments in a kind of philosophical sense of moments, meaning aspects, three aspects of lyric poetry. But I think it's better to say three basic emotional attitudes. The first is anticipation. The second is consummation. And the third is lamentation. Very Latinate words, very vague. We need some good Anglo-Saxon in here. I'll try to fill that in. So, anticipation. What do I mean? Poems that present the experience, the emotional experience of hoping for the good that's going to be enjoyed. Some good is present, imminently present, it's going to be coming soon, and I'm looking forward to it. The theologians would say, if they entered the room, well, you're talking about poetry that points to creation as ordered to the New Jerusalem. Yes. Okay. Yes, indeed. It's looking at the good to be achieved, the greatest of which in Christian revelation is life in heaven in the kingdom to come. What's a good example of this kind of poetry? I think the Song of Songs might be the best. The Song of Songs, that marvelous work, is made of many different poems that are kind of stitched together, I think. That's how I interpret it. And some of those poems are the highest human expression of this attitude of hope, of awaiting, anticipating with great joy and eagerness the good to come. In the Song of Songs, of course, that's the lover and his beloved who express their intense joy or their intense love for each other, and they call to each other, come away with me, my love. They're calling to each other. We're going to be united soon. That's anticipative lyric poetry. The second is consummation. This is pretty straightforward. You're enjoying the good right now. There's joy in the enjoyment of that good. The theologians would say, yeah, this is like hearkening back to the pre-fallen state of the Garden of Eden. All these goods around us that you're enjoying right now. Yes, yes. What's a good example of this? To stay with scripture for a moment, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. You got to use King James Version here. I know it may not be the most accurate, but it's one of the most beautiful. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. The whole psalm is, I am with my Lord, and I fear nothing. Everything is wonderful. joy in a union with my beloved right now. Of course, there's much love poetry that's about a man and a woman in the West, but this is the scriptural version. And the third is lamentation. This might be the most common one. What does that say about us humans? It's the loss of the good that was enjoyed or that we wanted to enjoy. Here, theologically put, you would point to creation and say, we're fallen human beings, and there's many things we want to enjoy that we can't, that we've lost by the sin of man in the Garden of Eden. So maybe to go more modern here, the modern example of this would be the famous Dylan Thomas poem, "Do not go gentle into that good night." This is a powerful version of it. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. That's the poem. That's the poet in deep distress, losing life, dying is coming. He's going to die, or he has died, in fact. I think in this case, if I remember correctly, it's someone else has died. Rage against the dying of the light. So lamentation. So lyric poetry, there are three basic emotional attitudes I'm proposing that it has towards the world: awaiting in hopeful anticipation the good to be achieved, enjoying that good present right now, and then lamenting the loss of that good. And theologically, for those who love theology, the awaiting points to heaven, the enjoying is creation. The Garden of Eden is kind of the central image there. And then the lamentation is the loss of the garden. It's the loss of the garden. Okay, so that's one division. Then I want to propose that there's a division in not just the emotional attitudes of lyric poetry, but the subjects that we treat. What are the kinds of things about which lyric poets speak? What are the kinds of goods that can be enjoyed and we can be united with and love, or whose loss we lament? And I want to propose, this is not exhaustive, probably, but I think it's a helpful division of the three kinds of goods that can be enjoyed or lost that lyric poetry presents. The most obvious is the beloved, the lady or the man. As you know, English poetry traditionally is, most poets are men in the history of English poetry, so it's usually a lady. But the beloved is a lady or a man with whom the narrator seeks to be united. That's the most obvious example. The second, also rather obvious, is God himself. A lot of poets speak about God as the good to be achieved and to be enjoyed, or whose loss they lament. And the third is a big group of things that I'm putting in a bucket that I'm calling the garden. And it's not my own phrasing, it comes from others. The garden meaning the wonderful world of creation around us. Oak trees, green hills, and thunderous oceans, hooting owls, amazing sunsets, little things in creation that are all good and worthy of being enjoyed, that poets point us to and say, hey, look at this. So that's the proposal, is that there are three kinds of things that we tend to, that poets tend to speak about as the goods that are desired or achieved or lost when they write poems. Again, this is rough and ready. This is not a rule. It's not even a best practice. It's just, it seems like inductively, these are the kinds of things that we tend to see in poems. Okay. All that being said, how should we approach reading or reciting or listening to poetry? This is the last part of the intro before we look at Sonnet 73. There isn't a method or rules. I don't think. Poetry isn't math. It's not auto repair. There's no manual. But there are best practices. And I want to propose a few of them. Readers of poetry must first lovingly attend to all of the elements of the poem, all that enters into the craft that the poet makes use of. And we have to take them in, and we should ideally revel in them. We should love them, wallow in them, appreciate them. What I want us to get to see over the course of the 8 weeks, because I think this is very true, is that the poem's meaning, to the degree that I want to say that word meaning here, the poem's meaning is not separated from these elements of the poetic craft, from the qualities of literary devices and tone and connotation, because the poem is not separated from the experience that's expressed with all those qualities. What this means ultimately, I think, is that poems make us see and feel. Or actually, better put, poems make us see in feeling something, or feel in seeing something. If we don't have both of those things going on, I don't think we have a successful engagement with a poem. We have to see something, come to know something, come to learn something, to see the experience being described, and we have to feel something about it, preferably what the poet wants us to feel, unless he's manipulating us. Then we have trouble. More about that later. So this means we have to be receptive to poetry. We got to take it in as it's meant to be taken in. And this means being emotionally open to the poem. And that's dangerous, but we have to give it that receptivity. Ever since Hesiod, the ancient Greek writer, poetry has been meant to move us. He says poetry came to us, or comes to us, from the muses as a way of gladdening the hearts of those who are grieved over some loss. The gods give this as a gift to us. It's meant to move us. I thought it was a pretty good description of wine, actually, but he says it's a description of poems. It works for that too. So we have to be receptive to the poem. We have to be open emotionally to it. Here's what C.S. Lewis says, that great prose writer, whom Tom Howard loved. He was one of his great admirers. C.S. Lewis says, the true reader takes every work seriously, in the sense that he reads it wholeheartedly, makes himself as receptive as he can. But for that reason, he cannot possibly read every work solemnly or gravely, for he will read in the same spirit that the author wrote. What is meant lightly, he will take lightly. What is meant gravely, he will take gravely. So we have to be open to the poem, to be moved by it, to be open to being moved by it, and then try to be moved in the way the author is meaning for us to be moved. Again, to the extent the author has that meaning consciously in mind, which is an open question, but let the poem move us. Now, great poems demand this even more than bad poems. Great works and great poems demand that we be open to them, to learning from them. If we come to the poem thinking, I've got my own opinions and views, and I'm just going to look at the poem and then make a judgment and not be moved by it, then we're missing the boat. There's an old story about, a colleague of mine tells about Justice Scalia, that when he was in high school, the English teacher was walking them through, I think, one of the Shakespeare plays. And the students, all different kinds of students, some were interested, some were not. One kid was not interested. And he said, look, why are we doing this? This doesn't move me. I'm not interested in this, in Shakespeare. This just seems to me to be nonsense, not helpful, not meaningful. And the professor took off his glasses and looked at the kid and said, son, you don't judge Shakespeare. Shakespeare judges you. What do you mean by that? I think he meant Shakespeare is great. If you don't see that, something's wrong with you. He has something to teach us that you have to be ready for. I think that's true. Another way to put it poetically, let me read you a very short poem by Rilke. We're not going to read any Rilke because he's not an English poet, but he's a great poet still. This is called The Archaic Torso of Apollo. It's a translation. Here's how it goes. We cannot know his legendary head with eyes like ripening fruit, and yet his torso is still suffused with brilliance from inside, like a lamp in which his gaze, now turned to low, gleams in all its power. Otherwise, the curved breast could not dazzle you so, nor could a smile run through the placid hips and thighs to that dark center where procreation flared. Otherwise, this stone would seem defaced beneath the translucent cascade of the shoulders and would not glisten like a wild beast's fur. It would not, from all the borders of itself, burst like a star. For here there is no place that does not see you. You must change your life. It's a strange poem. The torso speaks to you.
Evocative of the captives.
Say it again.
It's evocative of Michelangelo's captives.
Yeah. Yeah. The sculpture, despite lacking a head and legs, speaks to you. Its power and beauty is there, and it shines out, and you have to respond to it. You must change your life. It is beautiful, and there's something about you that's not. It's a powerful way of putting it. Okay, so to wrap this up and move into Shakespeare, the elements of the poem that we need to attend to are going to be the tone, the feel of the poem. What's the effect that it has on us emotionally? And we'll talk about our feelings. This is what we're going to do, among other things. We also have to attend to the literal meaning of the poem. You might call it the movement or the plot, the basic meaning or content of the poem. And that means being attentive to grammar, punctuation, syntax, diction, etc. We got to know who's speaking. We got to know who they're speaking to as much as possible. We got to know what they're saying, again, as much as possible. If we have ambiguity about who the antecedent is, then we got to try to figure that out. So those are the two big ones, tone and meaning. We need to attend to the meter or the rhythm, and I'll give us a little crash course on that as we go. What's the meter being employed here? Because once we do that, then we can look at spots where the meter changes. Poets will often change the rhythm intentionally. And those are important moments in poems. We need to pay attention to those. The rhyme. The rhyme scheme may not mean very much in some poems, but you'll find that the rhyme scheme contributes to the structure or division of the poem in many cases, and thereby helps you see the movement of the poem. And even if it's not clear that it does that, it's still wonderful to enjoy, so we might as well enjoy it. We have to attend to the images or the metaphors that are used in the poem. As Aristotle says, the poet has to have a genius for metaphor. He has to be a genius at finding metaphors. That's one of the central works of a poet, is finding the right metaphor. And lastly, we need to look at the themes that show up in the poem. What recurring topics, in other words, show up. Okay. You ready for some Shakespeare? Okay. I'll read Sonnet 73, but next time someone else will get to do the reading. Here we go. William Shakespeare, Sonnet 73. That time of year thou mayst in me behold, when yellow leaves or none, or few, do hang upon those boughs which shake against the cold. Bare ruined choirs, where late the sweet birds sang. In me thou seest the twilight of such day as after sunset fadeth in the west, which by and by black night doth take away, death's second self that seals up all in rest. In me thou seest the glowing of such fire that on the ashes of his youth doth lie, as the deathbed whereon it must expire, consumed with that which it was nourished by. This thou perceivest, which makes thy love more strong, to love that well which thou must leave ere long. Okay. What do we think about the tone here? How do we describe the feel or the tone of the poem?
Wistful.
How about pensive, tender, maybe even, of course, mournful?
I like mournful. That's what I was thinking with this.
The stronger version of wistful, maybe? Mournful. I like pensive too. It's thoughtful, it's reflective, but also mournful. Yeah. Any other thoughts about that, or does that seem right to the rest of us? Again, nothing esoteric here, just what's the feel that it gives us when we read it. Okay.
Yeah. One thing I want to say is, I think it depends how old you are when you read this, type of emotion it's going to bring. I would have felt, I'll tell you, I'm 68 years old. I'm entering the twilight of my life. This poem resonates with me, I think, in a way maybe some of you others that are much younger than me would resonate. I was reading it to my wife earlier, and we were having a discussion about it, and especially the couplet, the couplet at the end. That was, it's there's the word that you used earlier. It was halting. Now, is it as halting to someone who's maybe 20 or 25 as opposed to someone like me who's 68?
I think it's important to note that we'll have different reactions to different times of life or different moments of life. That's very true. Yeah, we shouldn't be afraid of that. That's very true.
Yeah, I like that. I like that interpretation, because life is definitely different when you got two teenagers. One of you is always, on the couch and running around and taking kids places. So yeah, it definitely hits different when you're older and have an empty nest or whatever your case is. When you're right in the thick of it, it definitely could feel, like what is this guy talking about?
Yeah, that's why it's good to give it the time, be receptive to it. Good.
Yeah, that said, one thing I would say is that I guess we will have different interpretations on it, but I think that when we're reading it, we want to actually listen to what the poem is saying and to actually try to get to the meaning that's there, right? So
Yes.
In other words, I think that a younger reader from reading this poem should actually start to actually hear of those things as if they were hearing it from as an older person would as well. And I think the same thing would hold for other poetry where it seems to be speaking more from the point of view of the young, that it allows, because I think that's one of the questions. There's always going to be a danger that we actually place our own interpretations in the poem rather than listening to what it's saying.
Completely agree. I think one of the principal benefits or goods of literature is that it puts you in someone else's shoes, the old and the young, or the young and the old. And it makes you walk in them for a while and appreciate a different vantage. And that means you have to be not just foisting your own interpretation on it, you have to be getting into the poem itself. And that means looking at the meaning of it, not just the tone. I think that's quite right. Yeah. Let's get clear quickly about the speaker and whom he's speaking to. Again, vaguely, we don't know very much, but to the degree that it's clear, who's the speaker or what's he like, and who's the person being spoken to.
My impression was that the speaker was reflecting to himself. He's looking back at his life, and as Michael said, in the golden years, considering all that's around him that he's enjoyed through life, and that this shortly will be gone.
That's possible. He does use the second person, you or thou.
I think he's speaking to a beloved. He's the beloved is younger than he is. He's older than the beloved, and he, of course, is facing his death, and the beloved needs to come to that reality that he's seeing these changes that old age brings on in him, and there's a certain sadness to that that intensifies the love that the beloved may have for the poet or speaker, I should say.
Why would you think the beloved is younger? I didn't get that.
Well, the beloved is not facing the same season that the narrator seems to be facing.
Well, maybe he is, and he's just pointing it out to her, to whoever he's speaking to. For him, right? For him, right? I didn't get necessarily that there was an age difference here.
Especially when you look at that last line, to love that well which thou must leave ere long. So thou must leave. You're not saying that thou will lose ere long, but thou will leave it. You know, so from that, I mean, it's almost as if the thou is actually the older.
Seems to me the
He
poet
does say,
is thinking of his
in
own
me thou
demise.
seest.
In me thou seest, right?
The glowing of such fire that on the ashes of his youth doth lie. It kind of implies, at least from what I can tell, maybe it's a sort of, we are both old and you will see your age, or you will see my age first before you recognize your own. And these kind of like, it's kind of like a memento mori almost, which remember you're immortal, where the person is telling you, you may not see, I mean, you don't see your reflection all the time. And so the main thing you see is when in others. There's been studies of couples that have been together for a long time that they start having, there's like a noted similarity between their faces, whether in certain shapes or certain elements of their faces. So there's a kind of this idea of if you're intertwined with two people, if two people are intertwined, they have a relationship that they recognize themselves in each other. And I think this is what, at least what the poem is, part of the poem is, he's saying, you look at me and you'll see things that you may find in yourself.
It's possible. The couplet is ambiguous and tricky, and I think intentionally so. We'll have to talk about that. It's good to lay out the options right now. I think it's good to be clear that there's ambiguity here. We don't have the other 126 or so sonnets in this grouping that would give us a better sense of a common person being spoken to. But in this own sonnet by itself, it's not extremely clear. We have an old man speaking, or an older man, and someone who may be younger or may not be, depending on how you interpret the couplet. I think it is a difficult question. And that's fine, being ambiguous for now about that. can we say, to get clear about the meter and the rhyme scheme here? Do you feel the regular thumping of the rhythm?
Well, I guess it's iambic pentameter, but it's got the pairs of syllables, and then there's 5 of them. That's consistent right throughout.
The first line for sure, huh? That time of year. I'm exaggerating here. Never recite a poem like this. I'm exaggerating, but for the sake of the meter, that time of year thou mayst in me behold. You wouldn't say that time of year thou mayest in me behold. Say it naturally, and you get that meter. Da dun da dun da dun da dun da dun. Yeah. When yellow leaves or none or few do hang upon those boughs which shake against the cold. So far, so good. But how do you read the next line? Is it da dun da dun?
It's reversed.
Yeah, it's changed. He changes it a little bit. It's not bare ruined, it's bare ruined. Stress, stress. Hard accent. Bare ruined choirs. So I think Zoltan's right, but there are moments here where we depart from the iambic pentameter. And it's important to note those moments, because then it's clear the poet is arresting our attention. He's changing it for some reason or another, whether it's conscious to his mind or not. Something is happening here. So yeah, bare ruined is 2 straight stresses in a row. I like that alliteration, 2 straight stresses. That's called a spondee in Greek, S-P-O-N-D-E-E, spondee, 2 longs in a row or 2 stresses in a row. It's called spondee because it's the way that they would have chanted the vows that spouses made when they were married. Very long, bum, 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 bum. So the spondee is long, long, or stress, stress. It's a powerful foot. So there's one spot. Do we see other spots where we depart from the iambic thumping, the ba-bum, 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 where it's something different? There's a few, I think.
Death, second self.
Yeah, how do you read that one in terms of what foot it is?
Like their ruined choirs.
Yeah. Yeah. So boom, boom, right? Death's second.
In the fourth line, is birds sang also both stressed?
I think so. That's a tougher one, but I think so. Yeah.
I have to ask a question there then. It's a difficult line because if that is a spondee that it starts with, then it would have to be a pyrrhic that follows in order to keep the number of stress syllables to 5, right?
Yeah, you don't have to keep the number to 5 though. Have to.
Okay, say more about that.
Yeah, so he's going to keep the 10 syllables, but he might have a line that's got more stresses than another line. And that's one of them right there, I think. Bare, so boom, boom, bare, ruined choirs. That's 3 right there. And then where late, the sweet birds sang. So Inshal, who was saying that there you might have 3 straight stresses at the end. You might have 7 stresses in this line. That does happen. So they don't have to keep the same number. That's not necessary.
So is ruined here? Is it supposed to be 1 syllable?
2.
Or 2?
Ruined.
Okay, so it'd be bare, stressed, stressed, and then the end of ruined, unstressed,
right,
and then choir stressed.
Right.
So it'd be stress, stress, unstressed. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, Carlo. Where should we back up to?
No, it's fine. When I read aloud, I always get funny looks that my rhythm is all messed up. So it's just something I gotta live with. But you know what I mean.
Do you agree that the general meter of the line here is that iambic ba-bum, ba-bum, ba-bum?
Yeah, I'm starting to get it. I also took the Nordic epic class as well, which was different. So that helped a little bit because I got to see the difference between English and whatever their language was. So yeah, that's helping a bit.
Okay.
So I'm catching on. I just
Okay.
want to see what my other ESL people were thinking.
Yeah, I want to know what Claudia's thinking, for example.
Well, one thing too is that you can, if you, okay, where it says in me thou seest, and also the other one, this thou perceives. It's explicitly elided, taking things out in order to keep it in that pentameter.
Right. Yeah. So the fifth line, the first one you referred to there, in me thou seest. We should treat seest as one syllable. He's trying to contract it. Right?
In that line is twilight both stressed? Because you're not stressing the of, I think you're stressing the light for those two.
So English, okay, unlike in Latin and Greek where it's pretty clear by rule when you have a long or a short syllable, in English, it's vague. We have levels of stress. So certain words on their own will have an obvious stress, but when surrounded by other words, that stress level will change. It's a mess. It's rough. So here I would say twilight, we don't say twilight, we say twilight. So I think we all agree that twi is the stressed syllable there. But then you're saying, but of comes after it. And of is almost never stressed, granted. But then what do we do? What do we think? Do we think it's twilight of, where we have twi stressed and then light and of both not stressed?
I think
Inclined that
such
way.
day is a spondy.
Say it again.
I think such day is a spondy.
Such day might be a spondy. Yeah, such might be stressed there. Yeah. But then are you agreeing that of and light are not stressed?
I think that light is stressed and of is not stressed. I know it's weird to have two stresses in one word.
It is,
but
yeah.
As when I'm saying it like out loud to myself, I think I'm stressing light, not as much as I'm stressing twi, but more than I'm stressing of or the or such around it.
Agreed. Yeah. So stresses in English are on a spectrum. It's not category 1 stress, category 2 unstressed. It's a spectrum. And where the division is at any one point between stress and unstressed is not always clear. So I agree. Light is more stressed than of. Whether I'd call that stressed is another question. Yeah, this is what makes English poetry difficult.
So another one that's not iambic is as the deathbed, and now I'm starting to see a pattern in the exceptions.
Tell us how it's not iambic.
Well, I can't say at time of year as the deathbed where on it must that doesn't work. So it's as the deathbed. There's like there's a halt there.
Boom,
and
boom.
kind of yeah.
Yeah. So there you're thinking as gets a little more stress, whereas the is not stressed at all. It's boom, boom, boom.
Yeah.
The deathbed. Yeah. So there he switched it from a not stressed to a stressed not stressed. It's the opposite of an iamb. That's called a trochee. Trochee, trochee. So trochee and spondy are the two principal ways that traditional English poets will move away from an iamb in one of those two ways. And Cherie mentioned earlier the Pyrrhic. The Pyrrhic is the third way. That's two unstressed in a row, back to back. But I think you're right here. As the deathbed is either unstressed, unstressed, or stressed, unstressed. It's
Could
not.
someone write those 3 words in the chat so I can know with
Yeah,
confidence how they're
I should do
spelled? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good point. Oh, how do you spell Pyrrhic? Help me here.
Pyrrhic is
Pyrrhic.
Thank you. The H is always the killer. So trochee is
okay.
stressed,
Great.
unstressed, spondy, it's stressed, stress. It's a stressful line. Powerful. Pyrrhic. Stress. So Pyrrhic is quicker usually. It's blah, blah, blah. You're trying to get through the word. But you're
So
right. As
And then
the
I am is unstressed, stressed.
Yeah.
So is this where we can see a little bit of the classical poetry that has to do with length? Because these spondies slow down, whereas a Pyrrhic speeds up.
Yep. Yeah. So yeah, that's right. So unstressed for us tends to take less time to say. Tends to, but it has other qualities too. Yep. And then spondies take longer. Now Lisa's pointing out that that's the third non-iambic element or part here that seems to have a pattern. I think I can see the pattern, but I want Lisa to tell us what she thinks the pattern is here.
Well, the feeling, okay, so there's something very kind of despairing, like exceptionally despairing or related to death in those moments. So bare, ruined choirs, death's second self, and as the deathbed. But the feeling that I get from all 3 of them is almost like beating your fist against your chest, or like this kind of feeling of emphatic frustration almost, or I don't know exactly how to say it.
Yeah, I agree.
Structurally, is it the last line of the metaphor? Is it the last line of each of the 3 metaphors?
Well, as the deathbed is the second to last one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which death second? So
Yeah.
Yep.
But the other 2, you're right. Yeah. And to reinforce Lisa's point, the 7th line has another, what these are called substitutions, when the poet changes out of the meter he's in.
Are you talking about Black Knight?
Black Knight. There you go. Those have got to be 2 stresses in a row. Now, Matthew makes the point in the chat that Timothy Steele argues that there are no spondies in English. Indeed. I don't buy it, but I think he's right that you're not going to have 2 back-to-back stresses of exactly the same kind or same level. But I think we'd be right to call them spondies still. But yeah, that's a good book. Timothy Steele's book is a good book to read. What's it called? All the Joys and How You Say a Thing. Is that right? I think that's the book. But yeah, so Black Knight, another hammer on the same theme of darkness, blackness, death, bare.
Deathbed later down seems to be the same.
Yes, deathbed is not an iamb. Deathbed is a trochee.
Isn't it also a kenning?
Say more, please.
Kenning?
Yeah. What do you mean?
Oh, deathbed.
What do you mean by kenning, though?
Old word. An Anglo-Saxon literary device that, for example, the famous one is the whale road as a word for the sea. It's evocative of that for me.
Huh. Oh, interesting.
I'm not sure if deathbed would be a kenning in the traditional sense, because it's an actual thing. A whale road is not a thing. The other ones that they use to describe a sea of like, or ships of like the seas horses galloping along or something like that to describe a ship. You know, I think I could be misinterpreting this entirely because I'm kind of an idiot, but when I think deathbed, I think the literal bed that you're going to die in.
So here it's metaphorical, but yeah, I can see your point.
Well,
the word itself doesn't have to be
metaphorical, but I think, you know, he's kind of like, because we've kind of established that, you know, this is a guy like in the kind of the twilight years of his life, maybe. And so he's imagining his deathbed. He's not it's not a like a metaphor to describe something else. It's not, you know, the sea's horses to describe ships. It's not a whale road to describe the ocean. It's not an angry hedgehog to describe a legion of Roman soldiers. I don't know. I think it could be more taken literally as he's describing his deathbed, not, you know, he's about to die. He's looking forward to like an actual thing, not a metaphor.
That's
But
all
it's situated there in that metaphor as a bed of ashes, not necessarily a deathbed. Now it certainly introduces the concept of his own deathbed, but it's still pretty ensconced in that metaphor.
Yeah, I think Kevin's agreeing. He's just saying there's an original meaning of that word that's not metaphorical, but here it's being used precisely as a metaphor, which is what made it feel like a kenning in some way. But even though originally it's not, I think that seems right to me at this point. So we have at least four or five principal spots where we have a metrical change, or what's called a metrical substitution. I think most of these are spondees. I know Timothy Steele has his opinion about that, which has a lot of merit, but they're certainly not iambs. And they certainly feel different than iambs. The other one that we should point out before we go is the first line of the couplet. So the Shakespearean sonnet has 14 lines. It has three, they're called quatrains. So a 4-line group is a quatrain. There's a 4 lines, then a 4 lines, then another 4 lines, and then a 2-line couplet at the end. That begins, this thou perceivest. This thou perceivest. That's not an iamb, it's bum, ba, ba, bum. So we have another change of the meter here that should arrest our attention. Okay. We have a commentary on Death's Second Self, which we'll get to next time. That's a fun one too. What is Death's Second Self? That's the question. So here's what I want to do. We're past 7. I could go on forever, but I don't want to keep you all forever. Let's continue this next time. I've only assigned 2 pretty short poems for next time, and I think we can get through 2.5. I think that's doable. And if we don't spend as much time on Milton as we do on Shakespeare, I'm sure Shakespeare won't mind and I won't mind. Milton might mind, but he can deal with it.